Nick Ryan, thank you for your time today. You've been vocally against the social media ban for under 16s. Do you think that the bill that passed this morning will work as intended?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think it will work as intended. So I was a paediatrician before I came to Parliament, and I'm the parent of 3 young people. And I know that social media can cause harm. There's no doubt about that. We're all concerned about that, and we'd all like to take action on it effectively. Unfortunately, I think this legislation won't do that. It's been rushed through really quickly. Experts from a number of fields, academic fields, have told us it's not going to work, it's going to be ineffective. And there are also significant privacy concerns that the government has failed to address in putting this bill before the House and the Senate. That being the case, I wasn't able to support it this week.
Do you think there's anything that can be done in the 12 months while it's being implemented that could, in your view, redeem the bill?
What the experts told us is that with trying to improve protections for young people on social media, the first thing to do is to institute a digital duty of care, where basically the social media platforms are presented with a set of rules and regulations which they have to respect and put in place to protect young people in the social media environment. Zoe Daniel put up a private member's bill for a digital duty of care on Monday morning, and I supported her in the House. The government didn't accept it, but that is actually the best way to start this process. Just putting a blanket ban on social media has the potentially untoward consequence or unintended consequence of young people getting around the system and the platforms having no impetus or no need on them to actually improve the protections for those kids who do remain in the system. Even the government was admitted pretty freely that it expects that young people will get around any ban that we try to put in place. And what we've done is pass legislation that doesn't force the social media platforms to improve the protections for those young people. So we're sort of really putting the cart before the horse here. What we should have done first is created a set of existing expectations for the social media platforms about how they are going to act to effectively protect young people on all sites that those young people are getting onto.
The Parliament also passed 2 major pieces of housing legislation this week. You've in the past said housing is a human right. Do you think that build to rent and help to buy go far enough?
Well, unfortunately, we do have a housing crisis in this country, and probably the most important thing that we can do right now is increase supply of housing. And so I was supportive of these bills when they came to the House. The build to rent bill that passed yesterday should be effective in creating an extra 80,000 homes, and that will make a difference. But it's true that the Help to Buy, the Build to Rent, the Housing Australia Future Fund, all of these schemes are too little and too unimaginative, unadventurous. That they need to be expanded. We need to have more vision, and Australians really need to be able to see that we are really acting as effectively as we can on the housing crisis for all Australians. What I'm being told every day in my electorate is that young people are losing hope of buying a home for themselves unless they can access the bank of mum and dad, and we don't really have any solutions for those young people at this point in time. So I'll be continuing to push the government on that in the months to come.
You just spoke of a need for an expansion there. Realistically, can an expansion happen in policy but practically before the next federal election?
Well, I think it's going to be really contingent on both the government and the opposition to come up with a really cogent, coherent plan on what they're going to do with housing prior to the next federal election. And if they don't, then the young people of Australia are going to hold them to account for that.
Absolutely. Another area that young people care a lot about, as you know, as the author of a massive petition into changing HECS, is the area of student loans. We did see the long-awaited passage of bills that would change the indexation on things like HECS and other student loans. Do you think that that goes far enough, and do you think that it will change the dial when it comes to how young people vote?
The government has moved the dial a bit on HECS in the last 6 months, and it was a great relief to see the legislation that will change the means of indexation pass overnight. That's going to make a big difference to a lot of young Australians, knowing that 2.9 million Australians have HECS debt. And the government also has hung out this potential cherry after the next election that they will cut HECS debts by 20%. But what we haven't seen is structural changes which will address the inequities of the HECS system. We have a HECS system which collects much more money for the government than it does from its petroleum resources rent tax, its so-called super tax on petroleum. The whole system's wrong. We've still got the situation where the Morrison-era job-ready graduates scheme, which doubled the price of arts degrees, law degrees and finance degrees, is still in place. So young people are still paying $51,000 for an arts degree. The government has left this. They've kicked that can down the road, and many Australians are going to be dealing with the residual of that failure to act for decades to come. So the job-ready graduate scheme needs to go. We need to expand prac payments for all care sector courses so that we can get kids doing nursing, pharmacy, radiology, medicine, all the things that we know that the healthcare sector is crying out for. And we need to address the question of indexation of HECS for once and for all. These are all things that this government has failed to do so far.
Do you think the changes that have been announced and passed were due in part or, mostly due to public pressure?
There's no doubt that the government has responded to the public pressure around HECS in the last 2 years. It was not on the radar at the last federal election, but people have suddenly seen the extent to which their HECS debts have really increased and snowballed over recent years. And we're seeing the downstream effects of that as well. We're seeing that the birth rate in this country has fallen. We're seeing that young people are getting married later and having fewer kids. And that's going to really affect us in the next few generations to come as we deal with the consequences of an ageing population. The government had to act because so many young people stood up and said that they needed that to happen, and their parents said that they needed it to happen. And so they did things like the 290,000 people who signed my petition or who wrote to the education minister or to their local MPs. They spoke out and they got the response that they deserved because they were so convinced of the righteousness of their cause. And the thing was, the situation is unfair. The system is unfair, and the government's only moved a little bit. It still needs to move a lot more to make this system a fair system for them.
Just quickly before we go, Monique Ryan, this week the Human Rights Commission released a roadmap to eradicating racism, and it highlighted the behaviour of parliamentarians as particularly significant. It suggested or recommended that parliamentarians sign a mandatory code of conduct for their behaviour. Would you be supportive of something like that in Parliament?
It's the most important house in the country. 1 million Australians come to Canberra every year and come to Parliament House. And I'm always embarrassed when I see people in question time looking at how parliamentarians behave. It is a real problem for us, and we do need to address the standard of conduct in the House and in Parliament more generally. And so I'm very supportive of a mandatory code of conduct for elected officials in Parliament, in the House of Reps and the Senate.
Monique Ryan, it's been a really big week for you. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
That's a pleasure.